Zachary Taylor. This is a president that I knew virtually nothing about before I read this book. I'll sketch him out, and then I want to hear, you take it from there. This is a guy, he's a war hero. He won the Mexican War, the U.S. Mexican War, which Lincoln had opposed, incidentally. But Lincoln still pushed him to become the Whig, and that was the party that Lincoln was a part of then, the Whig presidential nominee, because they figured he would win. It sounds like Zachary Taylor didn't talk about a single issue that he was for or against the entire presidential campaign, beyond saying that he's a war hero and he's rough and ready. His nickname was Rough and Ready. I'm going to be a good president. And the Whigs liked him because they figured that he would be a weak president and they'd be able to run the country basically from the Senate and the House, mostly from the Senate. He came into office, and it turned out that old Rough and Ready did have deep politics. He was a slave owner from Louisiana, is that right? And so the slaveholders felt like, we don't know a lot about him, but we know enough. He owned slaves. He's from the South. He's probably with us. That calculation could not have been more wrong, it turns out.
Here's the deal about Zachary Taylor. He's a general. He's considered semi-literate. He's considered inarticulate. The Whigs put him up because he's a figurehead, because he's a national hero. The last time they had a president was William Henry Harrison in 1840, who had won Indian Wars, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And so they thought they'd get another general, and they'd control him. The congressional leaders would control him. The Whig Party, which is the party of Lincoln, there are two major parties in America, the Democrats and the Whigs. And the Whig Party has a northern wing and a southern wing, and you've got to keep them both together. After the Mexican War, the Whigs looked like they were going to be split over what was going to happen to this territory that had been gained in the Mexican War.
And they won Texas, New Mexico.
Well, Texas, it was a republic. California's was briefly a republic, but New Mexico covered a huge amount of territory that are now many
up into Utah almost, right?
Yeah,
right.
Many separate states. It's virtually the entire West.
Okay.
Was it going to be slave or free? And it matters a lot because that will tip the balance of power in the country. If they're slave states, then they vote with the South and they keep slavery going. But if they're going to be free states, well, that could eventually lead to policies that strangle slavery. So Abraham Lincoln is a one-term congressman. He lives in a boarding house that is now on the site of the Library of Congress here in Washington. He framed a bill, a compromise bill, for emancipation in the District of Columbia. And it got not a single hearing in the House. That was his most notable contribution outside of a floor speech against the Mexican War. He worked very hard for Zachary Taylor's election. He was a partisan Whig. He was a supreme partisan. He wanted his party to win, and he wanted a patronage job, wanted a big job, and he didn't get it. He misplayed everything in the politics of inside Washington to get a patronage job, and he goes back to Springfield to his little law office.
Which is a good thing if he hadn't, good thing for him if he'd gotten a patronage job.
We would never know of Abraham Lincoln. That would be the end of Abraham Lincoln. He wanted to be head of the land office.
In Oregon or something.
Well, no, he turned down
his wife made him turn down the Oregon one.
Mary Todd was not going to trek across the country in a covered wagon to Oregon. So Zachary Taylor's president. And everyone thinks they can manipulate this guy and that he's nobody. He's just a screen behind which they can do whatever they want, except he has opinions. He's a Louisiana slaveholder. He owns sugar plantations. So the Southern Whigs, which is a large part of the party, think he's pro-slavery, except he's against having any extension of slavery in any of the territories except for Texas, in the territories gained from Mexico. He's adamant about it, and he's willing to go to war over it against the Southerners. They have meetings with him, the Southern Whigs, and he tells them, I'll lead the armies against you. I'm a general, and if you don't agree with me and you raise a rebellion, I'll hang you. He sounds like Andrew Jackson on a bad day.
Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stevens, like big name, Confederate.
Well, Davis has a complicated
Right.
relationship with Zachary Taylor because he's his son-in-law.
But he even threatened to hang Jefferson Davis.
He threatened his son-in-law.
Right.
And this is not what people expected. In this period beforehand, people have to, who may not know the history, there was something called the Wilmot Proviso. Abraham Lincoln called himself a proviso man. Why did he call himself that? It's because Wilmot Proviso would have prohibited slavery in the territories taken from Mexico. And basically, Zachary Taylor was going to enact by fiat the Wilmot Proviso. So there were other people proposing something else that became known as the Compromise of 1850. Where they would divide up the territory, they'd keep the Missouri Compromise that prohibited slavery across a certain parallel line north in the country, but they'd leave open this whole vast territory in the West to be decided, TBD.
Right.
TBD.
They could vote. They could vote.
They could vote to make it
Whoever has-
slave. And it,
Whoever has more guns.
and that opened the whole thing up to, future politics of grabbing control of the West. California was going to be a free state. It was just a free state. Mm-hmm. There was no way they could make it a slave state. Texas was a slave state.
Why is that? It
Because
had the
of who went there.
Same values that it has today in a way that had
It was
then.
California. Well, the gold rush.
Mm-hmm.
All those people who went to San Francisco were, basically Northerners for the most part, and they were not for slavery.
Right. They'd be out of jobs too.
So that it was, California was California.
Right.
It's always been California, in its own way, and so there's a crisis brewing. Looks like there might be a civil war, but it's 1850, and then you've got all these titans of the Congress who are sort of circling Zachary Taylor with this compromise, trying to do a deal. It's not his deal.
Right.
And he says he'll veto the whole thing.
And let's talk about how close it actually gets to war. So Texas sees what Zachary Taylor is doing and sees that he's ready to allow New Mexico into the country as a state, as a free state. And they say, no, in fact, we're going to conquer, basically, New Mexico.
Well, they say, we're going to send our army.
Right.
Remember, Texas had been a republic, sort of like Texas today.
Right.
And they said, don't mess with Texas.
So
and we're
all
going
of
to
these
take
states are
over.
the same.
We're going to take over New Mexico.
Right.
We're going to send our army to invade New Mexico. We'll take it over, and we'll make that whole territory, all the way up to Utah, slave territory.
And first they set up a fake election.
They do.
Right.
They run. They have an election commission.
Right.
They engage in voter suppression.
And all the New Mexico voters sounded like boycotted the.
Well, not only that, but there's a problem in this, which is that they have suppressed, in taking this over from Mexico, the fact that Mexico had abolished slavery in these territories.
Right.
They want to make territories that had been, where slavery had been outlawed, and make them slave territories.
Right. So first they came in and did the fake election. That didn't work. Then they threatened, we're going to go in with our army.
Right.
And we're going to install our own people in charge of New Mexico, and we're going to make it slave. And Zachary Taylor.
Zachary Taylor appoints a commander in the U.S. Army, sends troops, says, I'll go myself. I will lead the troops. I will crush any and all rebellions. He has meetings with leading members of the Southern Whigs, including Alexander Stephens, who later becomes vice president of the Confederacy, and threatens them. Says, I'll hang them, including Jefferson Davis, his son-in-law.
Yeah. And they tell him if he shoots at Texas, the whole South has Texas.
The whole
back.
South will rise up against the national government. So we're on the verge of a civil war, but it's 1850. And in Washington, all these congressional leaders want to do a deal.
Right.
And the deal is not what Zachary Taylor, the president, wants. The deal is, we'll leave it open, so they want to basically kind of preserve the status quo and give something to the South and appear to give something to the North, and they want a federal Fugitive Slave Act. And there's divine intervention.
So then on July 4th, would have been 1849, is that right?
1850.
Shows July 4th, 1850. Zachary Taylor is at a celebration of an Independence Day celebration on the Mall. He sits there in the hot sun for an hour.
Yeah, and then there are more speeches and more speeches.
Senator Foote, right, the one who pulled a gun.
Yes, who pulled a gun on the floor of the Senate.
Floor of the Senate.
Yeah.
And he's about to leave, and George Washington's step-grandson sees him and says, wait, you got to stay.
Wait, because I have to deliver a speech.
Right.
And we're going to put in the remains of, the Polish hero of the American Revolution, Kosciuszko, into the base of the Washington Monument. You've got to stay for
Got to be there for that. And
yeah, you can't miss that.
So it's middle of the afternoon. He's just getting crushed under this heat.
And he goes back to the White House, and he's famished, and he's thirsty, and he gobbles down all kinds of, strawberries, vegetables, water, milk, and it's all contaminated, and he gets cholera, and he's dead.
Like within days.
Within days, he's dead. And Jefferson Davis is standing over his deathbed.
Holding his hand.
As his former father-in-law is dying, who wanted to execute him, while in the Congress they're raising a pseudo-scandal, a bogus scandal to try and discredit the administration. So if anything can sound more contemporary,
right.
And the next thing you know, Millard Fillmore is president, another one who we don't know about,
right.
And then they do the deal. They do the deal, the Compromise of 1850, and they avert the Civil War.